Right now, the floor under your feet is holding you up, and you probably haven't thought about it once today. Neither had the people of Port Royal, where a diver is about to go. 40 feet down in Kingston Harbour, his glove closes on a pocket watch. Brass. Dutch-made. 1686. The hands are rusted to nothing, so they x-ray it. 11:43. That's the minute the ground under Port Royal turned to water and pulled it under. 6,000 people. One ordinary morning. Port Royal, the richest, wickedest city in the Caribbean. It had everything, right up until the Tuesday the ground it stood on gave way. In 90 seconds, the sea took 2/3 of it, and it almost took one man with it. Almost. The diver who found that watch came here first of anyone because of what's down here, a whole city. Streets, taverns, a church. The water is dark and thick with silt. Most days the divers work the drowned streets blind, reading the city by touch alone. And piece by piece, they're bringing a lost world back into the light. A Frenchman steps off the boat onto the Port Royal wharf. The worst day of his life already behind him. Louis Galdy, a Protestant from Montpellier, in a country that had just decided his faith was a crime. When the King of France tore up their last protection in 1685, 250,000 Protestants ran for their lives. Galdy was one of them. Most fled to England or Holland. A few kept going, all the way across the Atlantic to the one harbor in the New World that didn't care what god you prayed to as long as you could earn. Port Royal asked no questions. It took the desperate, the broke, and the wanted, and it made some of them rich. This thin spit of sand was the most lucrative square mile in the English-speaking world. 6,500 people crammed onto 51 acres. 2,000 buildings, 3 and 4 stories high, packed tighter than London itself. And forget the legend for a second. The hidden coves, the black flags, the men outside the law. That's the movie. The truth is stranger. In Port Royal, the pirates weren't outside the economy. The pirates were the economy. Spanish silver taken at sea, African gold, and anyone willing to take the rest at gunpoint, then spend it all here by morning. But the deepest money here wasn't stolen. It was grown, and it was bought and sold in human beings. Jamaica ran on sugar, and sugar ran on slavery. Port Royal was one of the busiest slave markets in the English Caribbean. The golden city Galdy walked into was built street by street on enslaved African lives. That is the part the pirate legend never mentions. And men like Galdy were exactly what a boomtown wanted. The refugees France threw away were often its best. Watchmakers, goldsmiths, merchants who could read a ledger in 3 languages. They carried their skills to whoever took them in and made those places richer. France's loss was Port Royal's profit. Here, a man's past didn't matter. Only what he could do by Friday. 4 separate goldsmiths set up shop in this one town, just to weigh the plunder and the profit pouring off the ships. And the man who built this machine started out as exactly the pirate the legend remembers, a Welshman named Henry Morgan. In 1668, Morgan stormed Portobello, and every man who sailed with him came home with 60 pounds in his pocket. Years of wages in a single raid. At Maracaibo, the Spanish Navy trapped him in a lagoon with no way out. So Morgan packed a captured ship with gunpowder, disguised logs as cannon and straw as crew, and sailed it straight into the Spanish flagship. It blew the blockade apart. He sailed home through the gap. 3 years later, he crossed the jungle on foot and took Panama itself, the richest Spanish city on the coast. He came back with so much gold, the whole struggling colony was refloated on it in one voyage. Now in the stories, this is where the pirate hangs. Port Royal flipped the ending. England was embarrassed by Morgan and rich because of him. So the king knighted him and sent him back to Jamaica as lieutenant governor. The most feared raider in the Caribbean spent his last years as the law, hanging the very men he used to sail beside. He guarded that respectable new name so fiercely that when a book came out calling him a common pirate, he took the London publishers to court for libel and won. 200 pounds and the book pulled from the shelves. One of the earliest libel cases of its kind. The Pirate King's final raid was on his own reputation, and in the middle of all of it stood one Anglican church, St. Paul's. Its rector was Emmanuel Heath. Emmanuel Heath. He preached against the drinking, the brothels, the greed. Week after week, mostly to empty pews, the place already had a nickname for itself, the Sodom of the New World. And Louis Galdy had finally, against every odd, made this loud, golden, dangerous place his home. A shop, a name, a second life. He had eaten his last quiet breakfast in it. On the morning of June the 7th, the sea would answer the sermon. Tuesday, June the 7th, 1692. Late morning, hot and dead still. Nobody in the city knew it, but they had built their paradise in the worst possible place. Jamaica sits on the seam between two of the planet's tectonic plates, the same restless fault system that would flatten Port-au-Prince just across the water in 2010. And Port Royal itself stood on the very worst ground of all, a spit of loose, wet sand dredged up out of the harbor. Reverend Heath had just finished the morning service. He was having a quiet drink with the acting governor before lunch. Then the wine in his glass began to move on its own. He felt the ground roll and asked the governor what it was. The governor said an earthquake and told him not to be afraid. It would soon be over. It was not soon over. Heath wrote the whole thing down 2 weeks later. We still have the letter. Quote, "I saw the earth open and swallow up a multitude of people, and the sea mounting in upon us over the fortifications. Here is what was actually happening under their feet. That wet sand stopped behaving like ground and started behaving like a liquid. So the buildings didn't topple over. They sank straight down, and the streets didn't just crack. They opened, and then they closed." Heath again. "The streets, with the people in them, were swallowed up by the opening of the earth, which then, shutting upon them, squeezed them to death. Several were left buried with their heads above ground. Survivors described the ground itself spitting water, geysers of sand and seawater bursting up between the cobblestones, the earth pumping like a lung. Whole wharves, with the warehouses and the people standing on them, slid into the harbor in one piece and kept going down. The first shock lasted under a minute, and then the harbor came back for what was left. A tsunami, thrown up by the underwater half of the same quake, rolled clean over the seawalls and into the streets. It lifted a Royal Navy frigate, the Swan, right off the water and carried it over the tops of the houses. And here is the strange mercy of that day. People who couldn't swim climbed onto the hull of that stranded warship, and it kept them alive. When the water finally drew back, 2/3 of Port Royal was simply gone. 33 acres of streets, taverns, warehouses, and the church that had warned them, all of it under the harbor. 2,000 people died in the first 90 seconds, and it didn't stop there. The harbor filled with the dead and the half-drowned. Aftershocks ran for days. There were reports of looters cutting the rings off bodies as they floated up. And then the sickness came. Fever moving through a town with no clean water and no walls left to keep anything out. In the weeks that followed, 3,000 more people died of their injuries in the fever. 5,000 gone. The richest city in the New World had become a graveyard between one church service and lunch. And the part of the city that sank sealed itself on the seabed and waited. Here is the part nobody expects. The earthquake didn't just destroy the city, it saved it. The buildings that went down fast, faster than the sea could smash them apart. Whole rooms dropped, settled, and were buried under mud within hours. And the mud at the bottom of this harbor holds almost no oxygen. Things that should have rotted away 3 centuries ago have been lying down there, intact, since the year the city fell. That is the secret of the watch. It sat in the silt for 2.5 centuries, and the brass survived. The hands themselves rusted away. But when Link's team slid the case under an X-ray, the shadow of the hands was still frozen exactly where they'd stopped. 11:43. It was the first time in history anyone recovered the exact minute of a natural disaster from the disaster itself. Nobody knows whose watch it was. In 1686, a timepiece like this was a small fortune, the kind of thing a wealthy merchant carried in his coat. Its tiny iron gears had rusted into a single coral-locked lump, but the brass case held the truth inside it for 267 years. and one X-ray plate read it like a fingerprint. Link proved the place could be read. Then a diver named Robert Marx spent 4 years on it in the 60s and mapped more than 20 sunken buildings, street by street, room by room. He wasn't surveying a wreck, he was surveying a town. And starting in 1981, an archaeologist named Donny Hamilton from Texas A&M gave this drowned town 10 straight years of his life. Inside one building, his team found a kitchen, cast iron pots and skillets, still sitting in the stone hearth, with the charred wood from the cooking fire fused right onto the metal. There was a bread oven beside it, a set of weights for measuring out flour. Somebody was making lunch when the floor opened underneath them. And we are looking at the exact pan they left on the heat. In another room, a stack of pewter plates lay where they'd toppled off a shelf. Nobody ever picked them up. Nobody could. Leather shoes, still soft. Glass bottles, still corked, still full. A clay pipe with the tobacco still in the bowl. Out of that mud, Hamilton's team pulled a whole way of life. From the bones in the rubbish pits, they could tell what people ate. From the bottles and the coins, who they traded with. From the pens at the water's edge, that this town turned sea turtles into soup by the thousand. They rebuilt ordinary days in a city that had been gone for 3 centuries. And to do it, they had to invent new ways of saving waterlogged wood and leather that are used on shipwrecks all over the world today. And the small things turned out to be the loudest. The maker's mark stamped into the pewter named the London workshops that cast it and dated the tavern almost to the year. Spanish silver, English bottles, and Chinese porcelain, all in one room, told the story of a port that traded with the entire planet. A single drowned street held a global economy. This is the street Louis Galdy walked, the tavern he would have passed, the kind of kitchen he'd have smelled at midday. All of it, still down there, 40 feet under a calm green harbor. Archaeologists have one name for a place caught like this: Pompeii. And Port Royal is the only underwater Pompeii in the Western Hemisphere. And here's the thing, in all these years, only a fraction of it has ever been dug. Most of those 33 acres are still down there, untouched. A whole drowned city, still holding its breath, still waiting. But for all the ordinary lives that mud gave back, there is one thing it has never returned. 4 years before the quake, the city buried its most famous son. Henry Morgan, privateer, knight, lieutenant governor, died in his bed, wealthy and respectable, after a lifetime of hard drinking. They sealed him in a lead coffin. The ships in the harbor fired a 22-gun salute across the water, and the colony called a truce on a rest for the day, so the old pirates could come ashore and bury one of their own without being hanged for it. They laid Henry Morgan in the cemetery out on the Palisados, the long, low arm of sand at the mouth of the harbor. That cemetery was one of the very first parts of Port Royal to slide into the sea on the 7th of June. Morgan's grave went straight down with it, and in 300 years of diving this harbor, his body has never been found. The sea kept the man, but not quite all of him. In 2011, a second team of divers, these ones off the coast of Panama, found 6 cannons in the hull of a wooden ship, right where Morgan wrecked 5 of his own vessels on the way home from that famous raid. The harbor took his grave. The reef, it turns out, kept his guns. And the search that found them was paid for, in part, by the rum company that put his face on a bottle. 300 years on, Captain Morgan funded the hunt for Captain Morgan, which brings us back to the refugee, to Louis Galdy, because on that same Tuesday morning, the ground opened under him too. It didn't crush him, it swallowed him, whole and alive, and closed over the top of him, buried underground, in the dark, in the middle of a collapsing city. And then the earth moved a second time, and the same ground that had buried him alive heaved and threw him back out. Into the open sea. He came up in the water, far from where he'd been standing. And Louis Galdy could swim. He stayed afloat in a harbor full of wreckage and bodies, until a boat reached him and pulled him in. He didn't leave. He stayed in what was left of Port Royal and rebuilt. Again. For the second time in his life, he started over from nothing. He gave the rest of his years to the church that had nearly become his tomb. Louis Galdy lived another 47 years. He died an old man in 1739. He was 80, and his gravestone is still standing, above the ground where you can walk up and read it today. It says he was swallowed up in the great earthquake, and by the providence of God was by another shock thrown into the sea, and miraculously saved by swimming. The richest, most powerful man the city ever made? The sea took his grave and never gave it back. The penniless refugee who arrived with nothing? His name is still carved in stone, above the water, on the exact ground where he should have died. He wasn't the only soul pulled alive from that harbor, but he is the one who made certain the rest of us would know it happened at all. The survivors of June the 7th did what survivors do. They crossed the harbor and they started again. They called the new town Kingston, and within a single generation, Port Royal, the most important English harbor in all of the Americas, had shrunk to a fishing village of a few hundred people. It tried to come back. A fire finished the first rebuild in 1703. A hurricane drowned the next in 1722. After that, the world simply moved across the bay and left it alone. Today there are no towers here, just sand, shrimp boats, and one old stone fort that lived through the whole thing. Because it was the one building set on solid rock instead of sand. And underneath the calm water, the rest of it is still keeping time. The kitchen with the pot still on the heat. The plates nobody picked up. The street the refugee walked home on. The grave the sea still refuses to give back. Jamaica has put the sunken city forward to become a World Heritage Site, the only one of its kind in the Americas. Most of it is still unread. Every dive could still turn up another frozen morning. But it's a race. Hurricanes still scour the harbor. The modern city presses in from the shore. The same sea that kept Port Royal safe for 3 centuries could still scatter it before we finished reading what's down there. And a Dutch pocket watch, made by a man named Blondel, 6 years before the world ended, still points at the exact minute an ordinary morning stopped. 1143. The wickedest city on earth is one of the quietest places in the Caribbean now, and almost everything it ever was is still down there, 40 feet under the water, waiting to be read. Up next, Cleopatra's father 5 meters under Alexandria Harbor, and the afternoon in 365 that put him there. Level off.